Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to ICT and IDC for inviting me back, and indeed through my friend Jerry Kramer continuing to support this wonderful partnership that we have between our institutions. May we go on for many, many more years yet. Well, after Michael Balboni, I promise not to say anything of practical value whatsoever. We're back to school here, but like Mr. Balboni, I'm going to take us back through the last decade or so in the United States, but from an academic perspective, focusing on law, which is what I do. By any measure, the September 11 attacks profoundly affected us in the United States, apart from the destruction of so many lives and the damage done to two of our most symbolically important buildings. The visual images of the attacks inflicted a level of trauma unknown to many Americans. The collective sense that we all had then of fear and dread, along with an understandable and quite palpable determination to rise up and do something about terrorism, precipitated changes in our laws and policies to counter the terrorist threat. Nearly 10 years later, I think there is an opportunity to stand back and take a look. The world, as seen from the United States, continues to appear a very scary place. Indeed, many would say, I think, or agree with this sentiment, that the 9/11 attacks were more like a bolt of lightning that illuminated essential contours of the international landscape than they were an earthquake that reconfigured it. Countering terrorism and other global threats had indeed occupied the United States during the final decades of the 20th century, yet 9/11 showed novel and potent dimensions and signaled an especially combustible combination of threats and challenges in the years ahead. Over the last decade, instead of the time-tested strategy of using overwhelming military might to respond to conventional foes, the U.S. confronted a mismatch between its power and a range of asymmetric threats. New laws and policies were created after 9/11, and they've marked very significant changes for the United States. I think a decade out, we can see and assess the ways the United States has attempted to counter the threat. We treated 9/11 quite understandably and correctly as an act of war. And we made a deliberative choice. The Bush administration made a deliberative choice, endorsed by our Congress a few days after 9/11, that indeed the United States had been attacked and was at war. The war paradigm made good sense to most observers at the time, and it helped mobilize support for a military invasion in Afghanistan a few weeks later. In the major military campaigns in Afghanistan and later in Iraq, and in the more episodic uses of military force by the United States, more recently in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, among other places, the U.S. has sought to win battles to gain tactical advantage over an elusive, amorphous, and non-state enemy. From the beginning, however, that is from the 9/11 beginning, the legal and policy implications of choosing to characterize the strategy to counter al-Qaeda and the Taliban as war were troubling. In effect, what President Bush called a new kind of war allowed him unilaterally to institute several new measures to detain, interrogate, transfer, and try suspected terrorists, launch preemptive war against Iraq, and targeted strikes against terrorists outside traditional battlefields, conduct wholesale warrantless surveillance electronically in the hopes of thwarting terrorist plots. For the most part, these new policies and laws have had remarkable staying power. As a result, I think it's fair to say now, I'm going to stake a claim, that the United States is creating more durable structures, processes, and institutions to undertake and control efforts to counter terrorism. Judging from the counterterrorism programs that have become part of our codified laws in the last decade, I believe a longer-term realignment of the relative importance of security among our government's objectives may be taking place. These new measures have significant implications for our nation's laws and governance, and some of them impact a range of civil liberties for non-citizens and even Americans. They've compromised, or some would say undermined, by new surveillance techniques, programs to detain, interrogate, and transfer and try those captured in a so-called war on terrorism, and more recently even to target a United States citizen suspected of terrorism with lethal force. Predictably, the aggressive assertion of executive power that marked out Bush administration's policies and programs was pushed back eventually, to some degree by the courts, to some extent by our Congress, and eventually, of course, by the voters. The Obama administration, I would say, has changed the music of countering terrorism in the United States. We don't talk about a global war on terror, but it continues to rely on many, in fact, nearly all, of the same mechanisms. Military force, drone strikes in numbers far outstripping what the prior administration undertook, including targeting of a United States citizen. It continues to rely on the practice of extraordinary rendition, which I'll have more to say in a moment, and it supports the use of a state secrets privilege to prevent challenges to those renditions from being heard in court. It is stalled, as you know, in its commitment to close the Guantanamo Bay detention facility, and it has modified only slightly the criteria for who may be subjected to military detention by our government. It's blocked actions to permit detainees in Afghanistan to seek judicial review of their detention, and it forges ahead for plans for military commission trials while continuing to back sweeping surveillance authorities. So in the area of counterterrorism, the Obama administration looks very much like the Bush administration with new music. I'll have a few more words to say about the music as we go forward here. I'm going to talk about a few select areas in slightly greater detail, and those that I don't have time to get to in my remarks here, I'd be happy to respond to in the question period that follows. Let's talk about the war paradigm for a moment. Many of you will recall in those few days after 9/11, the Congress of the United States, in its determination to rise up and do something, passed a resolution. Its acronym is the AUMF, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. In that resolution, Congress gave the President this following authority. I'm going to quote because it's important language. He was charged with using all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for September 11 in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such persons. There was no geographic limit placed on his discretion. There was no time limit placed on his power. And the authorization to prevent any future acts raises the possibility that military and other activities could take place against an unidentified enemy anywhere for the foreseeable future. The scope of the discretion given by our Congress to the Commander-in-Chief of our military was unprecedented in United States history. This authority did a great deal to cement in the Bush administration its powers to undertake the various initiatives that I mentioned in my opening remarks. Guantanamo Bay detention, military commission trials, coercive interrogation, rendering suspects to third countries, and implementing wholesale warrantless surveillance. 10 years out, and indeed in the second year of the Obama administration, the AUMF has become a very blunt instrument. The absence of a duration or location limit on the original authorization contributes to continuing ambiguities about the scope of the discretion of the United States to counter terrorism abroad. Early on, the Obama administration revised how it would interpret the AUMF standard. In a memorandum, the Attorney General indicated that their interpretation was that the authority was restricted to someone who was, quote, part of or substantially supporting the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or associated forces. Part of or substantially supporting. Now, admittedly, those phrases themselves are ambiguous, but they did provide some clarification. Second area, detention and trial, including trials by military commission. In the weeks after 9/11, when the United States began to accrue a substantial battlefield detainee population in Afghanistan, the Bush administration sought an offshore island location for a military detention facility. As you know, it created the center in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Following a military order promulgated by President Bush that allowed the government to detain without time limit any non-citizen whom the president had reason to believe was a member of Al-Qaeda, is involved in international terrorism, or has knowingly harbored such members. The same order authorized trials of these suspected non-citizens accused of committing violations of the law of war and other applicable laws by military commissions outside traditional civilian and military justice systems. By 2002, the military had removed several hundred persons from Afghanistan to the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. During the same period, the United States detained 3 American citizens it labeled as enemy combatants, not under the president's military order, you recall what I just said about that, but subject to the AUMF, the broad authorization conferred by Congress. In a first round of legal challenges to their detention, several of the non-citizen detainees at Guantanamo Bay petitioned courts in the United States for habeas corpus, that is to show cause why they shouldn't be released, on grounds that their detentions violated a range of protections in the United States Constitution. They asked for release from custody, they sought legal counsel, which had been denied them so far, and they sought freedom from coercive interrogation. On the same day that the Supreme Court, in a decision called Rosal v. Bush, that federal habeas corpus statute did permit Guantanamo detainees to sue in the federal court, the Supreme Court ruled in another case called Hamdi that Congress had authorized the president to detain enemy forces captured in that battlefield in the AUMF, once again. Now, a second generation of challenges that came along a couple of years later, I'm skating over many things here, limited the executive's claim powers over detention and trial by military commission. In a case in 2006 called Hamdan, the Supreme Court held that the Bush military order, the one he articulated in 2002 upon opening up the Guantanamo facility, the court held that that order authorizing trial by military commission violated the Geneva Conventions as well as some statutes in the United States. Within days, weeks, or a few months at most, the President and Congress responded to the court by enacting a Military Commissions Act, which created processes for trial by military commission that, as amended last year with the support of President Obama, remain to be tested. These trials are just underway in the United States as we speak here. Meanwhile, another Supreme Court decision in 2008 called Boumediene determined that the Guantanamo detainees are constitutionally entitled to pursue their habeas corpus relief in the federal courts, and thus that some statutes which had sought to curtail that review could not be enforced. The Supreme Court did not say what the standards for review would be in determining whether or not the detention at Gitmo was unconstitutional. That's being worked out in the lower courts as we go forward. Let me skip forward to another area and talk about extraordinary rendition. Rendition, as you likely know, is generally understood to be the surrender of a person from one state to another that has requested him, typically pursuant to an agreement or even an extradition treaty, for the purpose of undertaking criminal prosecution. Since the 1990s, however, the United States began transferring detainees to foreign countries for detention and interrogation without the request of the transferee country, sometimes where it's possible that those individuals would be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. This extraordinary rendition is so labeled because it involves no treaty, no formal agreement, and is attended by no judicial process. Beginning in 2004, journalists in Europe and in the United States began describing CIA transport of suspected terrorists to various undisclosed locations for coercive interrogation outside of public view and beyond the apparent reach of U.S. courts. There were sightings of agency use of Gulfstream turbojets, military airfields in Pakistan, Indonesia, and Jordan, along with scenes of hooded suspects being handcuffed while boarding. Human rights groups complained that the CIA purpose was to transfer detainees to countries that employed brutal interrogation techniques that were unlawful in the United States and in clear violation of a convention against torture. One at that time, unnamed official in the U.S. with experience in the rendition program explained, "We don't kick the blank out of them. We send them to other countries so they can kick the blank out of them." The countries apparently receiving suspects, including Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, had been identified previously by the State Department as purveyors of torture. Initially, the Bush administration declined to confirm or deny the CIA program, yet former prisoners who had been subjected to extraordinary rendition stated that they had been tortured, shackled, humiliated in various ways, and subjected to electronic shock. After that Supreme Court decision in 2006 called Hamdan that held that the detainees must have the protections of the Geneva Conventions, including Common Article 3's prohibition on torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, the Bush administration determined to close CIA prisons abroad and transfer 14 so-called high-value detainees, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, held in those facilities to Guantanamo Bay, where their interrogation would comply with new U.S. Army rules. Now, moving the clock forward, the Obama administration has not renounced the practice of extraordinary rendition. Indeed, the Obama Justice Department adhered to a Bush administration legal position in arguing successfully, as recently as last week, for the dismissal on state secret grounds of a case brought against a private company that had been allegedly involved in providing aircraft for the CIA renditions. That decision will soon be on appeal to the United States Supreme Court, but if I'm a betting man, I've got 10 shekels here, who says that the court will not be involved in deciding the case. A moment about targeted killing. The decision to target specific individuals with lethal force after 9/11 was not unprecedented in the United States, nor should it be surprising. In appropriate circumstances, the U.S. has engaged in targeted killing at least since a border war with Mexico in 1916. In a time of war, as you all know, subjecting individual combatants to lethal force has been a permitted and lawful instrument of waging war successfully. The components, however, of the targeted killing policy took on a sharper focus soon after September 11. We had a near miss on Mullah Omar on the first night of the campaign in Afghanistan in October of 2001, and soon thereafter, in November of that year, a missile-carrying Predator drone killed Mohammed Atif, al-Qaeda's chief of military operations, in a raid near Kabul. In May 2002, we tried but failed to kill another high-ranking Afghan factional leader, and then in November of 2002 executed an especially successful operation when a Hellfire missile killed a senior al-Qaeda leader and 5 low-level operatives traveling by car in a remote part of the Yemeni desert. Now, after years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, as you may be aware, the focus of attention for targeted killing by the United States has shifted to other areas, including the Waziristan region in Pakistan and various other places in Yemen and Somalia and so on. There was a guy named Masood last August 2009. Masood was killed when 2 Hellfire missiles were fired from a Predator drone piloted by someone at CIA headquarters in Langley. Masood was the commander of the Pakistan Taliban He'd terrorized the Pakistani government for years. He'd kidnapped Pakistani soldiers, deployed suicide bombers into the streets of Pakistan, probably masterminded the assassination of Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, and was implicated in attacks on U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Missiles struck Massoud while he was lying on the roof of his father-in-law's house, apparently while receiving intravenous drip for his diabetes or a kidney condition. His wife and uncle were killed along with his in-laws and 8 others, including his bodyguards. It was significant that Massoud was in Pakistan, not Afghanistan. And it was significant that the trigger was pulled by the CIA, not the U.S. military. I've spent a good part of my spring and summer testifying in Congress and reacting to media inquiries, particularly about these two aspects. Not on a traditional battlefield, not pulled by military, but by intelligence operatives. In 2009 and 2010, the Obama administration ordered more drone strikes in a few months than the Bush administration had ordered in 8 years. In the first months of this year, the pace quickened even further as more than a dozen strikes were carried out in the first 6 weeks of the year. If you pay attention to the media, you know that these operations are going on, and at least in a tactical sense, in many respects, quite successfully. Let me conclude with a couple of remarks about the bigger picture that I see here in the United States in the years going forward. I think we find ourselves fighting non-state terrorist groups in asymmetric military conflicts that were not the subject of the extensive international framework for warfare that was negotiated by the nations of the world after World War II. Even as our legal and policy regime for combating terrorism matures, the laws of the United States have arguably not kept pace with changes in the dynamics of military conflicts. The spheres of authority overlap. The laws of the United States, which of course involve the Constitution, legislation, executive authorities, and customary law, various international laws, including treaties and customs, and the laws of war, IHL, a subset of international law, applied during armed conflicts. The relationship of those spheres of authority to one another and their application as binding law is fraught with dispute and contentiousness. The lack of consensus on the legal rules reflects the changing nature of asymmetric warfare, and these so-called new battlefields, the project that we're undertaking here with ICT, require some adaptations of the old laws. In May of this year, President Obama articulated his first national security strategy. It departed from the strategy of the previous administration in part by emphasizing that efforts to counter what he called violent extremism are not the single-minded focus of the U.S. strategy, and by emphasizing that the U.S. will seek broad international support for its actions, it will also reserve the right to act unilaterally if necessary. The strategy does commit the United States to engage and modernize international institutions and framework, and it promises to submit decisions to checks and balances and accountability. Time will tell. A few years after 9/11, the policies of military commissions, Guantanamo Bay detention, coercive interrogation, extraordinary rendition, detention as enemy combatants of U.S. citizens, taken together, constituted an argument for a separate track, a sort of law-free zone for a time. In the last 5 to 6 years, the legal institutions in the United States have calibrated those moves to some degree, have pushed back on the extremeness of some of those initiatives. And I think it's fair to say today that the merging of our most aggressive activities in the few years after 9/11 with a more nuanced response by our courts and our Congress has led to the creation of a counterterrorism paradigm in the United States legal system that is part war, part law enforcement, but is really a new entity, a new species of law in the United States that is beginning to mature, that is looking for institutional coherence and consistency, that has attempts at transparency and accountability, and it is going to require a good many more years of practice to fully mature and understand. Thank you very much.